WCW Superbrawl Wrestling for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1994 by FCI. The first thing that stands out about this game is the opening segment, which, well, just watch.
Ladies and gentlemen, FCI presents WCW Superbrawl Wrestling.
Now that's actually quite a first impression for a 16-bit wrestling game, and if nothing else, Superbrawl Wrestling definitely throws its weight around in regards to presentation, what with the somewhat animated wrestler selection screen, the occasional character pop-ups during gameplay, and in what seemed like a rather novel touch for the time, there's the occasional bits of commentary from perennial WCW play-by-play man Tony Schiavone. Not just text blurbs, mind you, but actual quick voice bites. Yeah, voice bites from the actual wrestlers, or not quite impressive knockoffs. It's not much, they're fairly brief voice clips, and they do tend to get repetitive after a while, but still, it's something unique for the time, and quite frankly, something that you wouldn't get from the WWF games on the same system, so yeah, nice touch there. Let's run down the features of Superbrawl Wrestling, which gives you a roster of 12 WCW wrestlers to choose from. A varied cast of big names from the time such as Flair, Sting, Steamboat, Vader, Pillman, and the rest. There's not much in terms of match options. You can either do singles or tag team matches, determine the number of falls to be contested, toggle whether to enable countouts or be allowed to wrestle outside the ring without consequence, and determine whether to challenge for the television, United States, or World Heavyweight Championships, which in the context of Superbrawl Wrestling basically equates to a difficulty select from easy to hard. In terms of game modes, you can either compete in a quick exhibition match, compete in a tournament, or partake in the Ultimate Challenge, which is your usual beat everyone on your way to win the belt. The password system is used to resume your progress here, in case you're wondering. As far as gameplay goes, it's a fairly straightforward wrestling game where the object is to pin your opponent for the 3 count. This is usually done by draining your opponent of health using your arsenal of punches, kicks, suplex, pile drivers, and other bits and bobs. You don't have a grappling system per se, but rather 2 buttons that will grab your opponent and perform whatever moves depending on the combination of D-pad button press. As the match progresses onwards, the meter on the side will slowly build, and once you have a circle filled, you can perform your wrestler's signature maneuver by pressing B and Y at a certain position. You can go to the top rope and do flying moves, you can get out of the ring and fight there. Just be mindful of your strength meter because it's essentially your stamina meter. So far we have a basis for a rather decent wrestling game. Nothing spectacular, but hey, it's workable, we can get something out of it. However, there are a couple issues with the core gameplay, most of which are minor save for one point, but they bear mentioning. First off, the referee counts are way too fast, especially for the pinfall counts. In most wrestling games, you usually have a couple seconds to kick out of a pinfall attempt before the ref counts to 3, almost to the point where it feels like an eternity at times when you're doing the pinfall. In Superbrawl Wrestling, the ref seems to want to get this match over with as quickly as possible and will pull a fast count every single time. This usually means you have a split second to kick out before the count is finished. Fast counts across the board. Secondly, all the wrestlers have the exact same moveset for the most part, with the only thing distinguishing them being their signature maneuvers. And you know what? That's fine. It doesn't really surprise me, all things considered. I sort of expected that. Sure, it lessens the overall replay value because everyone plays the same for the most part, and it does seem a bit odd that a lighter wrestler such as Brian Pillman would have the same basic moveset as a big man like Vader, but that's not entirely detrimental to the overall gameplay, and let's be honest, the competitions games were pretty much the same thing. Thirdly, and perhaps most detrimental to Superbrawl Wrestling, is the relatively inconsistent nature of the controls. That is to say, they have a tendency of not working every so often. Not in the sense that you press a button and there's a lag between button press and execution, but rather in the sense that you press a button and nothing happens. Now, when controls work the way that they're supposed to, they work fine. You can pull off basic functions easily, you can even pull off signatures without a hitch, even during moments where it wouldn't be ideal to do such a thing, but sometimes there were moments where I could press any button and nothing would happen. There would be instances where I would attempt to pin an opponent whose health had been drained considerably and he would kick out instantly. Almost immediately he would go for a pinfall attempt, and despite nearly having full health and a full bar of strength, I would still get pinned for the 3 count, and all of this because the buttons wouldn't work when they're supposed to, because I can kick out of pinfall attempts just fine at certain points. And that's really the only sour point in what looks to be a somewhat decent wrestling offering on the Super Nintendo. Sure, what it has to offer gameplay-wise isn't much, kind of limited, but had the controls been fixed up to a point where it works the way they're supposed to most of the time, it at least would have been something decent. As it is now, it's still largely workable to a point, but perhaps best played with a friend for a more even battle. Visually speaking, Super Brawl Wrestling looks halfway decent. The various wrestler mugshots are nicely rendered, although not so nicely animated, but it's something, I suppose. The arena looks pretty good for the most part, taking on an isometric viewpoint a la Fire Pro. Every so often you'll have a 2-frame prop-up of Tony Schiavone cutting commentary, which is a nice, unnecessary, but otherwise non-detrimental touch. The wrestlers look alright for the most part. You can pretty much make out who's who, although some of them look a bit too generic for the most part. Also, another low point is the overall animation. All the wrestlers move about stiffly and bear rather choppy animation. On a whole though, not a bad looking game in all honesty. Nothing amazing, but it looks fine. Now here's the thing. Sound. Notice the lack of music throughout the gameplay footage here. Outside of the opening sequence, when you first start the game, which is the best part of the game by far, there is not a single note of music throughout Super Brawl Wrestling. No wrestler themes, no intermission tunes, no in-game music, nothing of the sort. Instead, the majority of the sound comes from the various sound effects of physical contact and mat slams, along with your usual manly grunts and that thing that's supposed to represent crowd noise. I mean, it's the strangest, most alien crowd noise I've ever heard. I'd very much like to know, and I'm being sincere here, I'd really like to know where they got this crowd noise because it is the weirdest crowd noise I've ever heard. As mentioned off the top of this review, you'll get quick voice bites from Tony Schiavone, which is something of a novelty feature for the time. Again, it's not much, it's not constant, and the brief bits of commentary can get a bit repetitive after a few rounds, but like I said, it ups the overall presentation a bit, and it's something somewhat unique as far as the SNES wrestling games go. WCW Superbrawl Wrestling, for better or worse, is a game that could be applauded for its presentation and sound quality, but is something of a flawed offering. On the surface, you have the makings of a rather solid wrestling game on display here, with the potential to be a good time had by all, and when it works well. Well, it works well enough, I suppose. What hurts Super Brawl Wrestling more than anything are the inconsistent control issues that make the game a touch more frustrating than it should be. That having been said though, WCW Super Brawl Wrestling isn't a terrible wrestling game. I've certainly played much worse than this, and in all honesty, despite the inconsistent control issues, Super Brawl in general is actually not that bad of a game. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a great wrestling title. I've certainly played much better than this. If anything, I'd say it's about average. Not bad for a rainy day, but it could have been better.